My friends, I'm writing to let you know that whether you like it or not, you're in a war zone. There's an enemy seeking to destroy you, and his allies are always coming after you. Believe me when I say the battle requires everything you got. Mental fortitude, physical prowess, and above all else, a prayerful dependence on the King who has faithfully given you everything you need for the spiritual power, knowledge, and understanding it will take for you to prevail. I beg you to continually read his word. His strategy is perfect. And even though the war has already been won, don't let that knock you off guard and lead you into complacency. There is an urgency to all of this, and we have a commandment to follow. Now, and this is very important, when you're out there, remember you're not fighting against flesh and blood, so don't get sidetracked or pulled into useless sparring matches. Stay the course. Since we fight differently than others, we'll be treated differently. Keep your eyes and ears open because we're being fired on from all directions. Be on the lookout, especially for spiritual and mental attacks. The enemy's ammunition is deceit, doubt, and fear, and it's launched strategically in the things we see, hear, and read. He is a wicked influencer, and he moves people to hurl vicious attacks on us, and he'll do everything he can to destroy the foundation of our faith and blind us so we don't help others. Stay bold. Stay true. Remain sober-minded. Hold closely the authentic word so you can spot the counterfeit immediately and demolish it. Don't fall for age-old tricks or sleight-of-hand misdirection. It's all fake and empty. Stand firm on the King's foundation. Go the distance. Fight the good fight. I know it's not easy, but now is not the time to run and hide. It's time to proclaim the truth and live by it. It's time to be ready and willing to boldly run forward with the gospel of peace as your inspiration. In one hand, you hold the impenetrable shield of faith, and in the other, the sword. Strike down arguments, ideas, and causes against the King. Be wise and make the most of every opportunity. And lastly, my friends, be prepared to answer people who genuinely want to know where your hope comes from in the midst of all this. They're in this war too, but they don't have the hope you do. Try to remember what that was like. Help them. Teach them the way. I wish I could have written about something entirely different. In fact, that's what I started out to do. But instead, my friends, I was compelled to urge you all to contend.
So, the devil. We find ourselves in the book of Ephesians, where we come to a chapter 6, and it begins to talk about this idea called spiritual warfare. Now, I want to begin this series with probably the only way that I know how, and I think the best way to start is like this. This morning, I want to defend the premise of what the Apostle Paul is talking about, the concept that there really is an invisible reality that you and I don't talk about very much. We really can't see it. We can't touch it. None of our senses, hearing and seeing and sight and smell and those things, alert us to its presence, but we believe that it exists and that it's all around us. And I want to defend that idea this morning. And as I preach on this idea of Ephesus, I want you to be aware that our culture, when people see this online, if anybody anywhere around the nation or anywhere who gets on our website and they listen to what I'm about to say and they hear this idea, they really do think that it's pretty ridiculous and that it is far out there. Now, the people in our culture believe that it is. It's just such a silly concept. But that's not true of people in Africa, and people in Asia, and people in Latin America, because for them, the idea, people in all kinds of other cultures and countries, the idea of spiritual warfare between good and evil is not an unusual, crazy, primitive concept. In fact, for most of the people around the world, the presence of the evil and an invisible spiritual reality all around us makes sense to them. And it helps them to wrap their mind around the atrocities that they experience in their own life, the poverty and the difficulties that they experience and the violence that they see. They wrap their mind around those things because of their idea and belief in an unseen spiritual reality and an evil presence in our world. But here, the U.S., we're way beyond this kind of uneducated, backward thinking, huh? We're here in our sophisticated, scientific Western culture. Most people around us find this concept that Paul speaks of in Ephesians 6, and that I'm talking about that right now. We find that a very unusual, foreign kind of concept. In fact, people make fun of it, where the devil's not a real being, a devil is a caricature. And what this whole belief of a spiritual reality that you can't see is really mocked and it's made fun of. And so I wonder, what about you this morning? Is there really a devil, an evil one, who is a personal spiritual kind of presence, and he is against you? For you, is there really someone like that? Are there really these invisible spiritual powers that have a vendetta of epic proportion against you simply because God loves you? And these spiritual forces set themselves up against anything that God loves and anything that's pure or lovely or good. These spiritual forces oppose that simply because God loves you. They're against you. And because you cannot keep God from loving you, you're simply going to be opposed. All humanity will simply be opposed because of that. Do you think that all of this kind of reality, a spiritual unseen reality, is truly real? And the Bible speaks to it and it says, absolutely. It's incredibly real. It's just as real as your flesh. It's just as real as you. And in Ephesians 6, we notice what? That we struggle, right? Your Bible may say wrestle. If you have a King James Version, it may say wrestle. I kind of like, though, the way that the Message Bible says it. In the Message Bible, Eugene Peterson says it like this, as he talks about this struggle and this fight that we're contending here. I like how he writes. He says, "This is no afternoon athletic contest that we'll walk away from and forget about in a couple of hours. This is for keeps. A life or death fight to the finish against the devil and all of his angels. A life or death fight to the what? The finish. The finish, all the way until the time when God takes you home." In Ephesians, we see a teaching that we contend. And in Jude, we contend. I contend. Everybody say, I contend. I contend. It's not just me, your preacher. It's not just your Sunday school teacher. You, friends, you contend in this. You fight, and you may not realize it or think about it when you get up in the morning, but you are contending. And in Ephesians, we see three things. We see who it is we fight. We see what we fight and how we fight. Who we fight. Not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces of evil. What we fight. The devil's schemes. How we fight. Do everything. So, who we fight. It is in verse 12 that we read, "We struggle not with flesh and blood, but against the rulers, the authorities, the powers of this dark world, and this, spiritual forces of evil all around us." Now, when it says that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, you need to keep in mind that Paul is not saying here that we do not contend with any flesh and blood versions of evil. He's not saying that. Paul is not saying that evil does not often manifest itself in flesh and blood forms. Evil does manifest itself in those ways, and Paul is against them. Paul, if he were here, he could have lifted up his shirt and showed you the flesh and blood marks on his back. And they're beating him because they're evil. And so there is really a flesh and blood kind of evil that we're against. Paul was not for that. When he was put in prison and when he was stoned and all of the flesh and blood manifestations of evil, Paul's not for all of that. He's opposed to all of the things we see with our eyes that are really evil. He doesn't like any of that. But what he's saying here is this, that we do not only fight with flesh and blood. When flesh and blood take the forms that we do see, or when evil takes flesh and blood forms that we do see, war and cruelty and violence and greed, strife, racism and sexism, crime and poverty and all of those things, what it's talking about is that evil is taking flesh and blood forms. And Paul is saying that those things participate in something that is above and beyond, that there is more than what is merely human and natural. So the forms that evil takes and how it manifests itself, those are the natural ways, but there is something behind the natural, a force, a power promoting those things, pushing them forward. Paul is saying that the evil behind the horrible things that we see is not flesh and blood. So our battle is not only against what we see, but it's against the thing we don't see as well, the evil behind all of those things. And y'all, until you recognize this, you admit it and you come to grips with all of this invisible dimension of evil in the world, you will never be able to understand its depth and its pervasiveness and its effect on you and effect on everybody you love, even right now in this moment. And that's what Paul is saying. How are we going to contend against an invisible enemy? And we have lots of ways to combat things that we see. But how do we combat the force behind the things that we see that's an invisible kind of thing? And of course, the invisible, the supernatural, the spiritual realm, when the rest of our world, the Western society, looks at our thoughts about that, they say, that is crazy with a capital C. You're way off. It's modern society. Our mindset is we don't believe in those kinds of things. Everything that we see, and if we see any evil in our world, modern society says it has a natural cause. And if we could just find what the natural cause is, then we can fix that. Everything has a natural cause, and therefore, modern society, the Western world, and our enlightened kind of society, we feel that everything, in fact, has a scientific explanation. And if everything has a natural cause and a scientific explanation, then crime and violence and racism and greed and immorality and war, all of those things have a natural cause. So what is the natural cause? Well, our society, we say that it is bad psychological factors, bad sociological factors. That the reason that somebody is very violent or that someone is racist is because they had bad sociological or psychological factors. They didn't have the right schools. And if they had just had the right kind of school to go to, and if their teachers would have been better, then maybe they wouldn't have been that way. Or maybe it's environmental factors, the science of changing the society around you and creating a better environment for somebody, that if we were just fix somebody's environment and give them loving mentors and put loving people around them, then that's going to fix all of those types of things, that all these things must have a natural cause. And that's what the natural causes are. And we say, well, there must be a natural cause for all of this, and if we'll just apply a more evolved science, if we could just get better, y'all, at sociology and psychology and education and environment, then we can eradicate all violence, all discrimination and poverties and all types of things that set humanity up against itself and that destroys us, that we can fix all of that if we could just perfect our sciences. And that's going to amend it all, that if we could just be more intelligent and more evolved and sophisticated that we can fix all of these things. I wonder, do y'all buy that completely? Now, we can fix a lot of things to fix those areas and to do better with it, but my question is, do you buy it completely? I don't buy it. And the reason is because there is evil that I've seen in this world and even experienced some, and I don't think that any amount of counseling can just fix the whole thing. There is an evil that is so pervasive in our world and so hideous that I don't see how we can explain the reason for its cause, and the reason that it's here is to say that we just have sciences that are not evolved to have fixed them yet. And you know what? I'm not the only person who doesn't buy it. There are people who are even non-Christians who don't buy this as well. There is a man named Andrew Delbanco, and he's one of those academic types. He's a professor at Columbia University, and he wrote a book a number of years ago called The Death of Satan. And in the book, he confesses to be a secular humanist liberal. He doesn't believe necessarily in God. And here's the funny thing, though, about the book, because he says something that you'd be hard-pressed to get any secular liberals to confess to at all. The first phrase in his book, The Death of Satan, says this: a gulf has opened in our culture between the visibility of evil, so the evil that we witness and see, that something is distant, and the intellectual resources to cope with it. That all of our ability to do research and to figure it out and to react to it, that there is a gulf that we can't, Delbanco is saying. And this isn't a Christian who's talking. This is a secularist who's talking. He goes on and he says this, that we've jettisoned in the West the idea, jettisoned, to throw away, we've cast it out in the West, the idea of cosmic evil, transcendent evil, and supernatural evil, that we don't believe in that kind of stuff. In fact, we don't even talk like we do. We don't even talk about the word. We don't use the word evil, he says, because to use the word evil implies value judgments and moral absolutes. So we don't use that. Instead, we use medical terms like dysfunction. And we talk about pathology. But we don't talk in terminology about evil. But Delbanco says this, that as 20th century has gone on and you've witnessed incredible atrocities, horrible things in our world, it's gotten harder and harder to say that the cause of all of that is simply that our sciences are not great, and we just need to keep evolving as a people. Scientifically, we need to get better at our sociologies and psychologies and educations, and that's the reason. But as the 20th century has gone on, and we have gotten better at our educations and sciences and sociologies, all that stuff has gotten better, and yet Delbanco says there is still this evil that's in the world, even though we're really good at sciences, even though there are counselors and self-help books everywhere, that this evil still moves. And he says this, that the holocausts and ethnic cleansings and serial killings, it's impossible for me to believe, he says, that all of that is just the result of bad psychology and sociological adjustment. That somebody is that way, somebody is racist just because they're just not well adjusted. He says there's something else at play right here. Delbanco turns to illustrate his idea to a very famous, and some of you will recognize it, a very famous interaction between two people, a conversation. And it's in the book called The Silence of the Lambs, and also in the movie The Silence of the Lambs. And Delbanco quotes this interaction between the policewoman, Officer Starling, and Hannibal, the monstrous Hannibal. And she goes to see for the very first time the horrible wretch that is Hannibal. And when she shows up, he's looking at her, and they can see one another. But she's talking to somebody else who's there, another officer who's there in the room with her. And she asks this question about him. She asks the man, and she says, what happened to him? What happened that made him so cruel? What happened to him? And Hannibal hears what she's saying. Bad mistake, Officer Starling. And so Hannibal speaks. And you won't be able to hear this without kind of hearing Anthony Hopkins' voice, but I can't do it like he does exactly. But he speaks and he says this: "Nothing happened to me, Officer Starling. I happened. You can't reduce me to a set of influences. You've given up good and evil for behaviorism, Officer Starling. You've got everyone in moral dignity pants. Nothing is ever anybody's fault. Look at me. Can you stand to say it? I'm evil." And Del Banco, who is quoting this, says, "Modern Western society people cannot answer the monster's question." As time has gone on, here's why we can't answer it. Because in our society, we see all of these things that have gone wrong, and we want to say that that thing that went wrong and that it went so bad and was so hurtful to humanity had a natural cause. And that if we just adjust our scientific, sociological factors and psychological factors, then we can fix the atrocities. But then we keep seeing the atrocities, and we don't know why they keep coming about, because we keep working on all the sciences. And so we feel in our society a very defeatist kind of mindset, that as much as we can advance in our sociologies and psychologies, and the better our education can be, and yet we still are encountering all of these problems. And so when somebody comes to even a secular liberal like Andrew Del Banco claims that he is, he says, "I don't buy it." It's too shallow a belief, and anybody who wants to have an intellectual kind of mindset, he says, "I don't know how anybody can buy it, that those sociological factors are the cause of all of the evil and atrocities that we see in our world." He says, "I find it wanting and not intelligent." And y'all, I agree with him. I got to tell you, I find a lot of it non-intelligent and wanting as well. Let me give you an example. One of the things that social scientists tell us is that racism and violence are only the result of uneducation, uncivilization, uncultured kind of thing, and that anybody who does that is primitive and unsophisticated and uneducated, that if we'll fix those things, we can fix all of it. And yet we deal and look at in history things like the Holocaust and the death camps of the Holocaust, which historically arose and were born out of the most sophisticated, the most educated, and scientifically advanced culture on the face of the planet. That something as horrible and evil as that came out of a culture post-Enlightenment. I mean, we're not talking about medieval times here. We're talking about the 20th century, post-Enlightenment, where our sciences have told us a lot about how human works. This is after Sigmund Freud. This is after we've been able to figure out a lot of things about how we think and behave and work. And even though the sciences have gotten amazing, the Holocaust still happened, and it happened in the middle of one of the most advanced scientifically European nations in the world. And all the racism sprung up in the middle of all of it. So we try again. And our world says, well, if it's not education and if it's not psychology, then maybe it's social. And that's what Marxism says. Marxism says that the problem is not educational or psychological, the problem is social, and that what we have to do to fix it, they said, was take the means of production and put it in the hands of what they called the proletariat, which is the people, the public, who owned all of the businesses, and take it out of the hands of the capitalist and put it in the hands of the proletariat, and then we'll fix society. And then people will have all of this ownership, and things are going to be great. And what happened? They tried it. And in the end, the proletariat was just as much greedy and oppressive as the capitalists were. And now even Marxism has been kind of thrown to the dustpan of history. It didn't work. And so we always try it. We see these efforts in our world to say the cause of this evil has to do with how we look at society and a philosophy and things like that. So here's my point. Everything that says evil is the result of an unevolved and unsophisticated science fails to sufficiently explain the reality of the pervasiveness and the depth of the evil and suffering in our world that you and I see and that you and I experience all the time. But y'all, even though modern Western society has this problem, and we don't know how to answer the monsters, and we don't know what to think about all of the evils, let me say this. The Bible does not have the same problem that we do. The Bible is very different. The Bible says there is an evil that is producing all of these things, and that evil comes from a thing called free will that God gives to man, and he gave to his angels. And when the angels chose to use that free will to rebel against God, then that is where we get the devil and all of his fallen demons from. They utilized a God-given thing to rebel against God. And the demons and the devil are personal, spiritual beings. And when humans chose to sin, the sin came upon us in a way that messed us up completely. And it affected our soul in the spiritual dynamic of who we are. That's what the Bible teaches. In Christianity, our belief speaks to all of this, and it puts it all into a way that we can understand it in a wonderful way, which says that environmental factors, which psychology and sociology speak of, aggravate, accentuate. They can shape the innate, the part of us that is evil and the part of us that's sinful, the innate self-centeredness, the innate pride that says it's only my way, the innate self-delusion, the innate blindness, the innate radical insecurities and the hatreds of the heart that sociological factors aggravate, accentuate, and shape the part of us that already wants to do bad. The part of us that's already sinful, that we can't see it necessarily. It's an invisible force of evil, and what happens is the bad things in our world get the evil that's already there and accentuates it, and it puts it out there and makes it plain and makes it noticeable. But those things do not cause the evil. Those factors don't make it and bring it into being. That there is a horrible evil all around us, and that's the cause of all of the rest of the things. Sin is already in our heart, and the devil uses these kinds of factors to aggravate and display it and make it known. And so that's the evil that you see in the world and experience all the time in our life. And so what we contend with is something that is not only flesh and blood. Yes, we contend with flesh and blood. For instance, here's how we contend with flesh and blood: missions and ministry. 3 weeks ago, we go out to the neighborhood and we do this community rummage sale. We are contending against poverty by helping give people the things that they need. That is a flesh and blood issue. We are contending when we do the C4 car care clinic by fixing people's cars. In a couple weeks, we're sending a mission team to Thailand. And then 2 weeks after that, we have a group going to Honduras and Kenya and these places. Why? Because there are some real things we're contending against, flesh and blood. But we do not only contend against that, because all of these problems, there is an invisible force moving it forward. There is a devil, and there are demons, and sin is real. And it's really bad. Now, as I say that, I know that it's hard because there's somebody here, somebody in the room today that has a lot of trouble believing in an invisible, evil spiritual kind of dimension, and especially believing in this thing called the devil. It just sounds so old-fashioned, and it sounds so primitive to you. And you think that it's kind of a figment of imagination. In fact, a lot of people will say, I love Christianity, except for those mythical, unintelligent, primitive ideas like the devil, like spiritual warfare. In fact, if Christianity could just get rid of all of that and we could talk about the human person of Jesus and how he loved people, but forget about all of those other supernatural kinds of myths, then maybe we might have a religion that other people would join. Because what they don't like are the myths and the unintelligent parts. And you have to admit, the last thing that any of us want to be is primitive. All of us want to have a faith that is intelligent and refined, and a faith that is contemplative, that we have really thought through. That we don't check our mind at the door when we accept Christ, that we engage our mind as well as our heart. All of us want that. And the devil just doesn't seem to jive with an intelligent faith. Somebody here thinks that. But I wonder this. I want you to ask yourself, if you don't believe in any of these things, if you think that it is naive and unsophisticated for me to talk about any of this and to believe what Paul is saying in Ephesians, I want to ask you, is it possible? Is it possible, perhaps, that by not realizing in the multi-dimensions that exist everywhere, and the spiritual depth dimension of human evil and the devil, that by not recognizing any of it, is it even possible that you are really the one being simplistic? That you might be the one being naive and not the people who believe in the devil? And is it even possible, I'll go so far as to say this, is it possible that when you say, you know what, believing in the devil is just backward and primitive, is it possible that you are even what's called culturally narrow? Now, the last thing that people in a very sophisticated, scientific Western world want to be called is narrow. We want to be called open, what? Minded, right. We want to be open-minded, not narrow. But I want to say this. If somebody says, I don't believe in the devil, I believe that you're being culturally narrow. Because while white people in the Western world may not believe in all of this spiritual warfare stuff, Africa and Asia and Latin America, they have no problem at all believing in the spiritual realm. And they have wisdom too, don't they? Or are we the only ones on the face of the planet that has wisdom? So that all of us, enlightenment people, with all of our well-defined and sophisticated sciences, that we are the teachers of the world? And that we go to all of these other cultures and enlighten them and help them to see that we're the only possessors of wisdom on the face of the planet? How culturally narrow could that be? Do other cultures have something to tell us? That is, the Chinese and Africans, as they say, this horrible thing happened, and there is a spiritual force that is moving in this world, and they have different ways of dealing with that maybe they have something to tell the American people when it comes to this, and all of our scientists and psychologists and sociologists. And not only that, but there are a lot of people in this world who will say, well, I believe in God, but I don't want to believe in the devil. Why not? If you believe in the possibility of a supernatural good being, then why wouldn't there be the possibility of a supernatural bad being? It makes sense to me that if there is one, then there surely could be the other. But the main thing is this. Y'all, if the Bible is true, and it is, about the devil and his forces of sin, then you and I will not be able to contend against the darkness in our own heart, the darkness in our family, the darkness in our town, and the darkness in our world without help. It's too much. The evil that I'm talking about is too much without help. And as we move forward in this series, I want you to keep coming, because what we're going to discover is the help that we so desperately need in order to understand how to contend. That if this is real, and I believe wholeheartedly it is, because how else can you explain the evils of our world? The only other option is to say it's natural causes. Shallow. Even secular liberals don't believe it anymore. There is a reality, y'all. Spiritual battle and spiritual warfare all around us, and you and I cannot deal with this by ourselves. The temptations are too real. The temptations are too legitimate, and we will all fail. And the devil wants you to be destroyed in divorce and financially, and to give up until you do what some of my own family members have done, and that is commit suicide, physically, emotionally, mentally, and give up on everything in the world. That is the movement that the devil wants for everybody. We need help. The first step in contending, I contend, the first step is saying this: help. God, help. I'm going to count to 3, and I just want you to say, God, help, as we bring this to an end. 1, 2, 3. God, help. That's right. That's right. We need him. If we're going to contend, he is the one who can help us do it.